Welcome to Lyra Echo Stories, where every story echoes emotions, memories, and hidden truths. Step in and feel the echo of every tale.
Every Friday, my husband left the house to see friends. But one day, I found a note in the trash. "See you Friday as usual. Kisses." It was for my husband. I said nothing. What I did when he came back. Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say you know. That somewhere deep inside, you always know. I used to roll my eyes at that. I thought it was something women told themselves after the fact. A way of rewriting the past so the betrayal felt less like a blindside and more like a tragedy they had quietly predicted all along. I didn't believe it until I lived it. My name is Sarah Callahan. I'm 38 years old, and for 11 years I was married to Daniel Callahan, a man I met at a mutual friend's dinner party in Lincoln Park, a man who brought me tulips on our third date because he remembered I'd mentioned once, only once, that roses felt too generic. I thought that meant he was paying attention. I thought that meant something. We lived in a gray and white craftsman house in Elmhurst, a quiet suburb west of Chicago, with a porch swing we never sat on, and a kitchen I had renovated twice because Daniel always had opinions about granite countertops. We didn't have children. That was a choice we made together, or at least I believed it was together. We had a dog, a golden retriever named Biscuit, who slept at the foot of our bed and was, in retrospect, the most honest relationship in that house. Our life looked good from the outside. I was a senior editor at a mid-size publishing house downtown. Daniel was a regional sales director for a pharmaceutical company. Good salary, company car, frequent travel. We had date nights. We had a joint savings account. We had a routine that felt, if not electric, then solid, reliable, safe. The first signal came so quietly, I almost missed it entirely. It was a Tuesday evening in late September. Daniel came home from work, kissed me on the cheek, and went straight to the bathroom. Nothing unusual, except that when he kissed me, I smelled something. Not perfume exactly, more like the ghost of it, a warmth on his collar that wasn't his. I told myself it was a colleague's hug, a crowded elevator, nothing. I told myself a lot of things that fall. Then came the Fridays. Daniel had always been social. College friends scattered across the city, the occasional poker night, work happy hours. So when he mentioned sometime in October that he'd started getting together with some guys from his old sales team on Friday evenings, I didn't blink. "Just unwinding," he said. "You know how it is." I did know, or I thought I did. But over the following weeks, I began to notice the texture of those Friday nights. He always left around 7. He always came back after midnight, sometimes closer to 1. He was never drunk, which somehow bothered me more than if he had been. He'd shower before bed, which he'd never done before. He'd be on his phone more than usual in the days leading up to Friday. Not obsessively, not in the way guilty men in movies behave. Just present with the screen in a way he wasn't present with me. I started paying attention with a precision I hadn't known I possessed. I noticed he charged his phone in the kitchen instead of on his nightstand. I noticed he laughed differently on those calls. A lighter, almost younger laugh, one I hadn't heard in years. I noticed that when I asked, casually, which friends he was seeing, the names were always slightly vague. Mike and those guys. You don't really know them. Small deflections, each one individually meaningless, collectively devastating. Still, I said nothing. I am not a woman who detonates without evidence. I am a woman who reads manuscripts for a living. I know how to spot a planted detail, a narrative that doesn't hold, a character whose behavior contradicts their stated motivations. I was reading my own marriage like a manuscript, and the plot had inconsistencies. Then came the Friday in November that changed everything. Daniel left as usual. I was in the kitchen making tea, and Biscuit kept nosing at the small trash can near the back door, the one Daniel used to toss receipts and gum wrappers before heading out. I lifted the lid, more out of habit than suspicion, to see if it needed emptying. There was a folded piece of notepaper on top. I almost didn't pick it up. My hand hovered. Some part of me already understood that the moment I unfolded it, I would cross a line I could not uncross. But I am also a woman who finishes books she starts, even the ones that break her. I unfolded it. See you Friday, as usual. Kiss. That was all. 7 words, handwritten in a looping feminine script I did not recognize. No name. No context needed. The paper smelled faintly of the same warmth I had noticed on his collar 2 months earlier. I stood in my kitchen for a very long time. Biscuit pressed his head against my leg. Outside, the November wind moved through the oak tree in the backyard, and somewhere down the street, a car alarm went off and then stopped. I folded the note exactly as I had found it. I placed it back in the trash. I finished making my tea. I sat down at the kitchen table and I did not cry, because I was already thinking. The night Daniel came home, I was already in bed, or at least I was lying in it. The room was dark. I listened to him move through the house, the soft click of the back door, the refrigerator opening, the familiar sound of him filling a glass of water, then his footsteps on the stairs, then the bathroom light under the door, then the shower. I lay on my side of the bed and stared at the ceiling and did what I do when a manuscript falls apart in my hands. I went back to the beginning. 11 years. I had left a good apartment in Wicker Park to move into his condo after we got engaged. I had turned down a job offer in New York, a senior position at a major literary agency, because Daniel said the timing wasn't right, because he said we were building something here. I had built my entire adult life around the architecture of this marriage. And now I was lying in the dark, listening to my husband shower off the smell of another woman, running the inventory of what I had given and what I had left. The financial picture was the first thing I forced myself to look at clearly, because emotions are harder to count. We had a joint checking account and a joint savings account, roughly $62,000 in savings, accumulated slowly over years, half of which was mine by any reasonable measure. We had the house, which we owned together, which was worth somewhere around $400,000, with the mortgage almost paid. I had my salary. Decent, not lavish. Daniel earned more than I did. I had no independent brokerage account. I had a retirement fund through my employer, separate, untouched. That, at least, was mine alone. I was not broke, but I was not as protected as I should have been. The fear arrived somewhere around 2 a.m, after Daniel had fallen asleep and I was still awake, staring at the ceiling. It wasn't the fear of being alone. I had lived alone before. I knew how. It was the fear of being erased, of a judge dividing our life into columns, of Daniel and whoever she was watching me scramble while they held whatever leverage they had quietly built, of being the woman who didn't know, of being a fool. I am not a fool. By 3 a.m., I had made a decision. I would not confront Daniel. Not yet. Confrontation without preparation is just noise. It gives the other person time to construct a defense, hide assets, align their story. I had edited enough thrillers and domestic dramas to know how quickly a careless first move becomes the thing that costs you everything. I would be quiet. I would be methodical. I would build my case before I made a single sound. The plan came together in pieces over the following days, the way a good outline does. Not all at once, but with an internal logic that solidified as I worked. Step 1. Document everything. I began keeping a small notebook, a plain black moleskin I bought with cash from the Walgreens 2 towns over, in which I recorded dates, times, behaviors, every Friday departure, every late return, every small anomaly. I noted the phone behavior, the shower pattern, the vague names. I dated each entry. I was building a timeline. Step 2. Protect my financial position before he could move anything. I didn't touch the joint accounts. That would be flagged immediately, and more importantly, it would tip him off. But I opened a personal checking account at a different bank, one he had no connection to, and began routing a portion of my direct deposit there each month. Small amounts, nothing dramatic. A cushion, an exit fund. I also called my HR department quietly and confirmed the details of my retirement account, made sure I was the sole beneficiary of my own policies. Step 3, find an attorney. Not a general family lawyer, a divorce attorney, specifically, someone with a track record in Illinois courts, someone who understood asset protection and had handled situations like mine. I didn't call anyone yet, but I researched. I made a short list of 3 names, read their reviews, looked up their case histories. The top name on my list was a woman named Patricia Holt, based in Oak Park, with 20 years of family law experience and a reputation, according to several legal review sites, for being methodical and formidable. I wrote her name in the moleskin and underlined it twice. Step 4, and this was the one that required the most patience, was evidence. The note I had found and returned to the trash was gone by Saturday morning. Daniel had emptied the can himself. I had no photograph of it, no copy. I had only my memory of 7 words in a looping feminine hand. That was not nothing, but it was not enough. I needed something more concrete. And I knew, with a cold certainty that surprised even me, that Friday would come again. It always did. In those days, I moved through the house like nothing had changed. I made dinner. I asked about his week. I laughed at the right moments and was quiet at the right moments. And I watched him the way you watch someone you are studying, not someone you love. And I understood, with a grief I kept very carefully contained, that the woman who had loved Daniel Callahan without reservation was already gone. What remained was someone else entirely, someone patient, someone precise, someone who was just getting started. I called Patricia Holt's office on a Wednesday morning in December from my office downtown, with the door closed and my coat still on, because I hadn't been able to make myself take it off. The receptionist asked what the matter concerned. I said, as evenly as I could, that I was looking to consult about a divorce proceeding. Hearing myself say the word out loud, divorce, was like pressing on a bruise I hadn't acknowledged existed. It hurt more than I expected. I made the appointment for the following Tuesday. Patricia Holt's office was on the 2nd floor of a brick building in Oak Park, above a dry cleaner and across the street from a coffee shop with steamed-up windows. The waiting room had good chairs and bad art, and a receptionist who smiled in a way that was professional without being warm, which I appreciated. I didn't want warmth. I wanted competence. Patricia herself was in her mid-50s, with silver-streaked hair cut short and reading glasses she wore pushed up on her forehead like a second set of eyes. She shook my hand and closed the door, and I told her everything I knew. The Fridays, the note, the financial structure of our marriage, the timeline in my moleskin, which I had brought in a sealed envelope. She listened without interrupting, which I respected enormously. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Illinois is an equitable distribution state. That means marital assets are divided fairly, not necessarily equally. You've been smart about the accounts. What you need now is documentation of the affair, not to prove fault, because Illinois is a no-fault divorce state, but because it will matter for the tone and pace of negotiations. Judges are people, context matters. She paused. Have you considered a private investigator? I had. I told her I was prepared to retain one. She gave me the name of a firm she had worked with, a man named Gerald Marsh, based in Cicero, discreet and thorough. I wrote the name below Patricia's in the moleskin. That Tuesday afternoon, driving home on the Eisenhower, I felt something I hadn't expected, a thin, clear thread of relief. I had a professional on my side. The machinery had begun to move. I was no longer just a woman lying awake at 3 a.m. I was a client with a strategy. What I didn't anticipate was that the other side had begun to sense something too. It was subtle at first. Daniel, who had always been casually careless with his phone, leaving it on the counter, charging it openly, suddenly became more deliberate. The phone went everywhere with him. He started closing the home office door when he took calls in the evening, something he had never done in 11 years of marriage. And one Friday in mid-December, he came home at a different time than usual. Earlier, just after 10. And when he came into the bedroom, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not guilty, more like assessing. You seem quiet lately, he said. Work has been heavy, I said, without looking up from my book. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary. Then he said goodnight and went to brush his teeth, and I turned a page I hadn't actually read. He was watching me, which meant she was watching me too. I called Gerald Marsh the following morning. He was precisely what Patricia had promised. Quiet, methodical, with the flat affect of someone who had heard every version of this story and felt nothing about any of them except professional interest. We met at a Panera in Berwyn in a back booth, and I gave him the basic facts. He asked practical questions. He quoted a fee. I paid the first installment in cash I'd drawn from my new account over 3 separate visits to the ATM. He said he'd be in touch. I gave him 3 Fridays. He needed 2. On a Friday evening in early January, Gerald followed Daniel from our house to a condominium complex in River North, 15 minutes from the city center, new construction. The kind of building with a glass lobby and a doorman and monthly rent that cost more than most people's mortgages. Daniel parked in the underground garage. Gerald photographed the car. He photographed the timestamp. He photographed, through a lobby window with a long lens, Daniel in the elevator with a woman, dark-haired, late 30s, in a gray wool coat, who pressed the button for the 14th floor and leaned against my husband's shoulder as the doors closed. Gerald sent me the photographs the following morning as an encrypted file with a brief text message, 14 separate photos, timestamps, license plate confirmation. Call me when you've reviewed. I reviewed them at my kitchen table on a Sunday morning, with Biscuit asleep at my feet and Daniel still upstairs in bed. The photographs were sharp and clear and entirely unambiguous. There she was. Dark hair, gray coat, the easy proprietary lean of a woman who had been doing this for a while and had stopped being afraid of being seen. Her name, Gerald's follow-up report confirmed, was Meredith Colby. She was 36, a marketing consultant, divorced once, no children. She had lived in that River North condo for 14 months. 14 months. I sat with that number for a long time. I closed the file. I sent a single-word reply to Gerald. Received. Then I texted Patricia Holt. I have the documentation. When can we meet? I was calm. Completely, thoroughly calm. Because the note in the trash had been a suspicion. This was a fact. And facts, unlike feelings, cannot be argued with, cannot be rewritten, cannot be explained away over a kitchen table conversation that leaves you doubting your own memory. The point of no return is not a dramatic moment. It doesn't announce itself. It is simply the moment when the last possible version of the story in which you were wrong disappears. And what remains is the truth, standing in your kitchen on a Sunday morning, quiet and immovable. I had reached it, and I was ready. Patricia Holt filed the petition for dissolution of marriage on a Thursday morning in January. I was at work when it happened, sitting at my desk, reviewing a manuscript about, of all things, a woman rebuilding her life after loss. And Patricia sent me a brief text at 10:47. Filed. He'll be served within the week. I read the message twice, set my phone face down on the desk, and went back to the manuscript. There was nothing else to do in that moment. The stone had left my hand. All I could do now was watch where it landed. Daniel was served on a Tuesday afternoon at his office. I know this because Patricia's process server confirmed it by text, and because Daniel called me at 3:52 p.m. Not from his cell phone, but from his office landline, which he almost never used, as though he was too rattled to think clearly about which device to reach for. I was in a meeting. I let it go to voicemail. I listened to the voicemail in the parking garage that evening, alone in my car with the engine off. His voice was low and controlled, but I had spent 11 years learning the frequencies of his calm, and underneath the control, there was something tight and frightened. Sarah, I need you to call me. I need us to talk about this before it goes any further. Please call me. A pause. This isn't what you think. I did not call him. When I arrived home, Daniel was already there, which was unusual for a Tuesday. He was sitting at the kitchen table in his coat, as though he hadn't decided yet whether he was staying or leaving. Biscuit was pressed against the back door, uneasy in the way dogs are when the air in a house changes. Daniel looked at me when I came in with an expression I had never seen on him before, something that lived between desperation and calculation, and I could see him deciding in real time which one to lead with. He led with desperation. That was a mistake. It told me he was afraid. You could have talked to me, he said. I did talk to you, I said, hanging up my coat. For 11 years. That's not fair. Daniel. I turned to look at him. I have photographs. I have timestamps. I have 14 months of a lease in River North. So let's not have the conversation where I'm being unfair. The color left his face in stages. First the neck, then the jaw, then around the eyes. He hadn't known about the investigator. He hadn't known I had photographs. He had assumed, I think, that this was emotional, a gut feeling, a blow-up, something he could manage and de-escalate with the right combination of remorse and reassurance. The photographs made it architectural, undeniable. He understood in that moment that the ground had been shifting under him for weeks, and he had been standing on it without knowing. He left that night to stay with his brother in Evanston. He took a bag. I watched him go. What I hadn't fully anticipated was Meredith. I should have. In retrospect, she had just as much at stake. More perhaps in terms of what she had invested and what she stood to lose. Patricia had warned me that when a third party feels the legal process closing in, They sometimes make moves of their own. I had nodded and thought I understood. I hadn't understood completely until Meredith called my cell phone on a Saturday morning, 11 days after the filing, from a number I didn't recognize. Her voice was composed, polished, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed this call. "Sarah," she said, "I think we should talk, woman to woman, before this gets out of hand." I said nothing. "The things you think you know," she continued, "are more complicated than you understand. Daniel and I, there are things about your marriage you haven't been told. I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because if you proceed with this, you're going to find out things that hurt you much more than anything I could say right now, and you're going to wish you'd had this conversation while you still had options." It was a well-constructed speech. The implication was clear. There were secrets about my marriage, about Daniel, possibly about me, that Meredith controlled, and that she would deploy if she felt threatened. It was a threat wrapped in the language of female solidarity, which made it, if anything, more insulting than a direct ultimatum. "Meredith," I said, "my attorney's name is Patricia Holt. You can have your attorney contact her." I ended the call. She called twice more that day. I forwarded all 3 calls to Patricia, who noted them in my file and sent a formal cease and desist communication to Meredith on my behalf. Patricia also advised me calmly to document any further contact attempts and to change my locks, which I did that same afternoon. A locksmith from a company Daniel had never used, paid with my separate account. By Sunday evening, the calls had stopped. But the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the silence of people repositioning, of people who had been caught off guard and were now taking stock, deciding what to do next. I knew that. I didn't let it shake me, but I'd be lying if I said the week hadn't cost me something. My hands shook slightly when I poured my morning coffee. I slept badly. At work, I sat in meetings and said the right things, and felt completely hollow inside, as though I had spent so much energy being precise and controlled that there was nothing left for the ordinary functions of being a person. Patricia noticed it during our Thursday call. "You need to rest," she said, not sympathetically, but practically, as though rest were a tactical resource I was mismanaging. "A tired client makes mistakes. Take the weekend. Don't check the file obsessively. Let me do my job." I took that advice. I drove up to Wisconsin that Friday, alone, with Biscuit in the back seat, and rented a small cabin outside of Lake Geneva that I found through a last-minute booking site. I walked Biscuit along the frozen lake shore on Saturday morning, in the white and gray quiet of January, and I did not check my phone for 2 hours, which was more peace than I had felt in months. The water was still. The sky was the color of ash. Biscuit ran ahead of me on the ice-edged path, and I stood there, breathing in the cold, and thought, I am still here. They have not broken me. That was enough for that morning. It was enough. I came back from Wisconsin on Sunday evening steadier than I had left. Not healed. That would take time I hadn't yet accounted for, but leveled, calibrated. I fed Biscuit, unpacked my bag, and stood in the kitchen of the house I had renovated twice and made a cup of tea, and the silence felt different than it had before. Cleaner. Like a room that had been emptied of furniture and was waiting to be decided about. Daniel called on Monday. He had, in the week I'd been moving between legal consultations and locksmith appointments and sleepless nights, apparently done some version of the same thing I had done, gone somewhere quiet and thought. His brother's apartment in Evanston, in his case, which was less picturesque than a Wisconsin lake but presumably served the same function. When he called, his voice was different. The calculation was gone. What remained was something rawer and more deliberate. "I need you to hear me," he said. "Not as your attorney's client, as my wife." "Daniel, please." A pause. "I know what I did. I'm not going to pretend. I'm not going to tell you it didn't happen or that it meant nothing. You wouldn't believe me and you'd be right not to. But I am telling you that it's over. With her, I ended it. I need you to know that." I sat with that for a moment. Biscuit was asleep in the square of afternoon sunlight near the back door. Outside, someone was shoveling a driveway. "Why did it start?" I asked. Not because I wanted an answer that would change anything, but because I wanted to hear what he would say. He was quiet for a long moment. "I don't have a good answer for that. I have reasons, but they're not good ones. I think I convinced myself that you were fine, that we were fine, that you didn't need things from me that I wasn't giving." His voice caught slightly. "I was wrong about that." "Yes," I said, "you were." Another silence. Then, "Can we try? Can we? I don't know if it's too late. I need to know if it's too late." And here is the thing I did not expect. I felt something. Not love, exactly. Or not the love I would have felt a year ago, before the Fridays, before the shower at midnight, before the note in the trash. But a pull. The residue of 11 years and a man who had once driven an hour to bring me tulips because I'd mentioned, only once, that roses were generic. The ghost of a marriage that had not been entirely invented. I let myself feel it. For 30 seconds, I let myself feel it completely. Then I said, "It's too late, Daniel." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "Is there anything I can do?" "Talk to your attorney," I said. "Cooperate with the process. That's what you can do." I ended the call and sat at the kitchen table and pressed both hands flat against the wood surface, breathing steadily, the way my therapist had once taught me. Though I hadn't seen that therapist in 3 years, which was itself a small indictment. I made a mental note to call her. Meredith, meanwhile, had gone quiet in a way that was more unsettling than her calls. Patricia noted, at our Wednesday meeting, that Meredith had retained her own attorney, a man named Bryce Keller, who Patricia described, with precisely calibrated neutrality, as aggressive. Patricia was not concerned, but she wanted me to be aware. "She's going to try to influence Daniel's position," Patricia said, "to protect herself. What she's protecting herself from, exactly, remains to be seen. But people who call a spouse and suggest they have dangerous information rarely have as much as they imply." I asked what she meant. Patricia looked at me over her reading glasses. "I mean that her opening move was designed to make you feel that she holds power. Whether she actually does is another question. We'll see what Mr. Keller produces." I drove home through the gray January afternoon and thought about what it meant to let someone believe they had power over you while you quietly verified whether they did. The social support came, as it often does, not from where I had expected, but from where it was already waiting. Her name was Donna Reyes, my closest friend from college, now living in Evanston, 2 blocks from where Daniel was staying at his brother's, which was a geographic irony neither of us chose to dwell on. Donna was a high school history teacher, blunt in the way that only genuinely kind people can afford to be. And when I called her on a Thursday evening and told her everything, the note, the photographs, Patricia Holt, Meredith's calls, she was quiet for exactly 4 seconds and then said, "I'm coming over." She arrived with red wine and leftovers from her dinner, and the specific energy of a woman who intends to be useful. We sat at my kitchen table until midnight. She did not tell me I should fight for my marriage. She did not tell me I had done something wrong. She listened, and when she spoke, what she said was, "You've been handling this alone for 2 months. You don't have to." It seems like a small thing. It was not a small thing. To have one person who knew the full shape of what had happened, not a lawyer, not a private investigator, not a therapist I was paying by the hour, but a friend who simply knew and was on my side without conditions. That was the thing that got me through the next phase. Not the photographs, not the legal strategy. Donna, sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of wine, saying, "You don't have to." I told her about Meredith's implication, that there were things about my marriage I hadn't been told. Donna raised an eyebrow. "Do you believe her?" I thought about it honestly. "I think she wanted me to be afraid of what I didn't know." Donna nodded slowly. "Which means whatever she knows, she thinks it's powerful enough to stop you. That's interesting." It was interesting. I filed it away. There were things still to be discovered. I knew that. The story wasn't over, but I was no longer reading it with dread. I was reading it like an editor, looking for the logic, following the thread, waiting to see where it went. I was, for the first time in months, genuinely unafraid. They came on a Saturday afternoon in February without warning. I was in the living room with Biscuit when I heard the car pull up. Daniel's company sedan, which he still had, the lease not yet resolved, and then voices on the front porch, low and coordinated, the voices of people who have rehearsed. I understood, before I opened the door, that this was not a spontaneous visit. It was a performance. Daniel. And behind him, slightly to the left, in a camel coat and dark leather gloves, Meredith Colby. I stood in my doorway and looked at her. This was the first time I had seen her outside a photograph, seen her in 3 dimensions, in the winter light, at my front door. She was attractive in a precise, deliberate way, the kind of attractiveness that requires maintenance and effort. Her expression was arranged carefully, not hostile, not apologetic, measured. She had good posture. She was watching me the way people watch others when they are deciding how much to respect them. "Sarah," Daniel said, "I know we should have called. I'm sorry. But Meredith we thought, it would be better to do this in person." "Patricia Holt is my attorney," I said. "Her number hasn't changed." "This isn't a legal matter," Meredith said. Her voice was the same one from the phone call, polished, rehearsed, with the faint suggestion of things unsaid. "This is a human matter. We're asking for 10 minutes. I should have closed the door. The fact that I didn't was not weakness. It was intelligence. I wanted to know what they had. I wanted to see what the 10 minutes contained." I stepped back and let them in. We stood in the living room. I did not offer them seats, which I was aware was deliberate, and Meredith looked around the room with an expression that was almost imperceptibly proprietary, a woman surveying terrain she had considered and discarded. I noticed it. I noted it. Daniel spoke first. He said what he'd already said on the phone, that he was sorry, that he wanted to find a resolution that wasn't destructive for either of them. Then he paused and looked at Meredith, and something passed between them. A glance, a permission, the handoff, and she spoke. "Sarah," Meredith said, "I want to be direct with you because I think you're a direct person." She folded her hands in front of her, composed. Daniel and I have been together for longer than you know, closer to 2 years. She paused to let that land. In that time, I've been made aware of certain things about your marriage that I think you deserve to know, not as a threat, as information. Another pause. Daniel told me about the miscarriage in 2019 and about what happened afterward, the counseling you refused, the way things changed between you. I'm not telling you this to wound you. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that your marriage had been over for a long time before I was in the picture. The question of fault is a lot less clear than your attorney has led you to believe. The room was very quiet. Biscuit had retreated to the hallway. I looked at Daniel. He was looking at the floor, the miscarriage. He had told her about the miscarriage, the most private, most painful thing our marriage had contained. The thing we had agreed, silently and without words, was ours alone. The thing we had never discussed with family or friends or anyone. He had told Meredith. He had given her that. I stood with that knowledge for exactly the time it took me to take one breath. Then I spoke. "I see what this is," I said. My voice was even. I was surprised by how even it was. "You've come here with something private and painful, and you've presented it as information when it's actually leverage. You're hoping that if I feel exposed, if I feel like my grief is now in the room as evidence against me, I'll be more likely to agree to terms that benefit you." I looked at Meredith. That's not directness. That's manipulation dressed as compassion. And it's not going to work. Meredith's composure shifted slightly. Not much. A small tightening around the eyes. "I'm not trying to—" "You drove to my house," I said, "without an appointment, with my husband, to discuss private medical history in order to pressure me into dropping or altering a legal proceeding. Patricia Holt is going to hear about this conversation in detail. If you have anything further to say it through counsel." Daniel looked up. "Sarah." "Daniel," I said, and the way I said it stopped him. Flat, final. "You told her about the miscarriage. That's what I'll think about when I need to remember why this is the right decision. Thank you for making it clear." They left. Meredith first, then Daniel, who paused at the door with an expression that might have been shame or might have been the face people make when they realize a gamble has failed. The door closed. I heard the car start. I heard it leave. I sat down on the floor of my living room, with my back against the couch and Biscuit pressing his warm weight against my side. The miscarriage. 2019. 7 weeks along. We had told no one. I had cried in our bathroom with the door locked, and Daniel had sat on the other side of the door, and neither of us had known how to talk about it afterward, and so we hadn't. Not really. And the silence had been its own kind of wound. I had not known until this moment that Daniel had carried that wound to someone else and used it as currency. I was afraid, in that moment, not of Meredith and her attorney, not of legal proceedings, but of the specific grief of discovering how thoroughly I had been alone in a marriage I thought I was sharing. But the fear, like she had said on the phone, was more information than threat. And what it told me was this: I had been alone in this marriage for longer than I'd admitted, which meant leaving it was not abandonment. It was accuracy. I picked up my phone. I texted Donna. "They came here together. I'm okay. I'll call you tonight." Then I texted Patricia. "They visited in person, together. I'll write up the full account. I believe it constitutes a further violation of the cease and desist." Patricia's response came within 4 minutes. "Good. Write everything down while it's fresh. This is actually helpful for our position. I got up off the floor, I fed Biscuit, I made dinner, and I was, if anything, more certain than I had been that morning. Some confrontations are meant to break you. They succeed only if you let the fracture define you rather than inform you. What Meredith had brought into my living room was supposed to be a bomb. Instead, it was a map of exactly how far Daniel had gone, what he had given away, and why there was nothing left here worth saving. I was not broken, I was oriented, and I knew exactly where I was going. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in March at Patricia's office in Oak Park, in the same building above the dry cleaner, with the professional receptionist and the bad art. Present, Patricia and I on one side of the conference table. Daniel, his attorney, a man named Greg Ferris, who specialized in collaborative divorce and clearly hadn't expected a case this adversarial, and separately, Bryce Keller, Meredith's attorney, who had applied to be present as a representative of a third party with relevant testimony. Patricia had allowed it after considering it for 2 days because she wanted Meredith in the room. People who think they have power make mistakes when they're forced to demonstrate it, she had told me. I wore a navy blazer and no jewelry except small gold earrings. I sat with my hands folded on the table and looked at each person in the room in turn when they spoke. And I did not look at Meredith more than I looked at anyone else, because I did not want her to think she occupied a special place in my attention. Daniel looked like a man who had been sleeping poorly for 2 months, which was accurate. He had lost weight. His attorney kept a hand near his elbow in the way attorneys do when they are prepared to physically intervene with a touch. Meredith sat to Bryce Keller's right, in a structured blazer, her expression the same measured composure she'd worn to my front door. But I had been watching people's faces for professional reasons for 15 years. I had read manuscripts where the character's emotional state was in the subtext, not the text. And what I saw in Meredith's face, underneath the composure, was calculation mixed with something that was not quite fear, but was its close neighbor. Anticipation. The anticipation of someone waiting to see whether the gamble pays. Patricia opened calmly and precisely. She presented the photographic evidence, Gerald Marsh's work, 14 photographs, timestamp confirmed, professionally documented. She presented Daniel's cell phone records, which her subpoena had obtained, showing a pattern of communication with Meredith's number spanning 22 months, not 14, as Meredith had claimed. She presented the financial record of Meredith's condo lease, which confirmed the start date, and a credit card statement, obtained through discovery, showing that Daniel had contributed to 3 months of that rent. Greg Ferris objected twice. Patricia overruled him, methodically with citations. Then Patricia placed at the center of the table a printed transcript. "This," she said, "is the text message exchange between Mr. Callahan and Miss Colby during the 72 hours following service of the divorce petition, obtained through court-ordered discovery. I'd like to draw attention to the exchange beginning on page 4. I had read the transcript. I knew what was on page 4. It was Daniel and Meredith in the first days of shock after the filing, when they believed they were still private, still coordinated, still ahead. In the exchange, Meredith had written, 'She doesn't know about the accounts. We have time.' And Daniel had replied, 'Are you sure? She's been weird for weeks.' And Meredith, positive, 'She doesn't have the access. Just stay calm and let me handle the narrative.' The accounts they believed I didn't know about. Patricia calmly produced, next, a second set of documents. During the discovery process, forensic accounting on Daniel's finances, which Patricia had requested and the court had granted, had revealed something that Gerald Marsh had not been hired to find, but Patricia's forensic accountant had. A separate investment account in Daniel's name, opened 18 months ago, into which he had been routing small transfers from our joint savings, below the threshold that typically triggers spousal notification, done slowly, methodically, to the cumulative total of $41,000. $41,000. Built up over 18 months. Moved so carefully that I hadn't noticed, because I had been watching the surface of our finances, and he had been working underneath it. Daniel's face, when Patricia set that document down, went through a sequence I will not forget. First, confusion, as though he didn't understand what she was placing on the table. Then, recognition. Then, the particular blankness of a man who has run out of moves. Greg Ferris put his hand on Daniel's arm. Meredith's composure held for approximately 4 more seconds. Then she turned to Bryce Keller and said, low and rapid, something I couldn't hear. And Keller shook his head in a way that meant not now or possibly there's nothing to do. We'd also note, Patricia continued without raising her voice, that Ms. Colby's presence at my client's residence on February 15th, in coordination with Mr. Callahan, following a formal cease and desist communication, constitutes a documented violation. This has been submitted to the court. We are not seeking criminal remedy at this time, but it is part of the record. Bryce Keller objected. Patricia acknowledged the objection and moved on. The deposition continued for 2 more hours. Daniel answered questions in the flat, careful voice of a man talking to a judge he is afraid of. At one point, Greg Ferris called a 5-minute recess, and through the glass partition of the conference room, I could see Daniel and Ferris in conversation. Ferris with his hands spread in the gesture of an attorney explaining an untenable position. When they came back, Ferris said that his client was prepared to cooperate fully with an equitable settlement. I looked at Patricia. She looked at me. She gave the smallest possible nod. Meredith, I noticed, was looking at me. Her composure was intact, but it had changed quality. It was no longer the composure of someone who believes they hold leverage. It was the composure of someone maintaining dignity after a defeat. I looked back at her steadily, without hostility, without triumph, without anything except the calm attention of a woman who has read the whole manuscript and knows exactly how it ends. Outside, afterward, standing on the sidewalk in the March cold while Patricia reviewed her notes, I felt the specific lightness of a weight that has been carried so long you forget it is there, until it's gone. How do you feel? Patricia asked, not warmly but practically, as was her way. Ready, I said. She almost smiled. Good, because the settlement negotiation starts next week, and that's where we finish it. The settlement negotiation took 3 sessions over 2 weeks. Patricia had built the forensic accounting into the foundation of every argument, and the $41,000 in Daniel's hidden account gave us leverage that Ferris couldn't maneuver around. The house was mine. The joint savings split equally. My retirement fund untouched. The hidden $41,000 returned to the marital pool and added to my share as compensatory equity. When Ferris tried to negotiate that last point, Patricia set the forensic report on the table without comment. He stopped. At one point during the second session, Daniel and I ended up alone in the hallway. He looked at me with the blankness of a man who had run out of moves. I didn't mean for it to be like this, he said. I know, I said, and I did. It didn't change anything. The agreement was signed on a Thursday afternoon in late March, 32 pages. I read every one and signed with a steady hand. Meredith's leverage had rested on the assumption that I was afraid of what she knew. When that collapsed in the deposition room, all that remained was an ended affair and an attorney's bill. Keller submitted a statement. His client had no further comment. A formal surrender in the language of legal neutrality. I called Donna from the parking lot. "It's done," I said. "Come over, I'll make dinner." I drove to Evanston with Biscuit in the back seat, and I thought about what I was carrying. The house, the equity, the retirement fund, the 11 months of careful deposits. Biscuit, Donna, the knowledge that when they had brought my own grief to my front door as a weapon, I had looked at them and said no. I had been exactly who I needed to be. A year and a half passed. The Craftsman house in Elmhurst became mine in the fullest sense. I repainted the living room a deep, warm gray Daniel would have objected to. I planted a raised bed for tomatoes and herbs and a climbing rose on the back fence. I sat on the porch swing I had never sat on before, on summer evenings, with a book and a glass of wine, and found it exactly as pleasant as I'd always suspected. Work expanded. I was offered the editorial director position I'd been passed over for twice, and I accepted it. I began therapy. I eventually met a man named Paul, who read literary fiction and never made me feel like I was being assessed. It was early and careful and good. As for Daniel and Meredith, they tried. It lasted 4 months. The architecture of an affair rarely survives the removal of its defining feature. In ordinary daylight, without the secrecy and the drama, they found they had less in common than the secret had made it seem. Daniel was consulting on a contract basis now, making less, living alone in Logan Square. Meredith had lost clients and opportunities. Neither outcome surprised me. It was simply the ordinary arithmetic of lives run off course. On a Sunday morning in October, Biscuit and I walked the neighborhood in the early light. Leaves down, maples in their full, ridiculous orange. We came back to the house, and I stood in my kitchen with my coffee and looked at the space I had made mine. This is enough. This is exactly right. The woman who had stood at her kitchen trash can and unfolded a note with 7 words on it. I knew her, but I was not her anymore. She had been standing at the beginning of something. I was somewhere further in, where the view was clearer and the house was warm and mine. That was the life, and it was good. That is my story. I found 7 words in a trash can, and I had a choice. Collapse, confront, or prepare. I chose to prepare. I learned that dignity isn't taken from you. It's surrendered. Or it isn't. I chose not to surrender mine. Meredith thought information was power. She was right. But she had the wrong person's information. If you found that note, what would you have done? Leave a comment. I read everyone. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for being part of Lyra Echo Stories. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because every echo never truly fades.